Hey everyone, Spencer the Knowledge Pharaoh from Sky Sports' Ringside Toe-to-Toe Boxing Podcast and hashtag Toe-to-Toe. Listen up, give Sporting Icon a follow.
So finally, we actually have some kind of talking points now from David Haye and Tony Bellew as far as their match goes, which is around 4 weeks away now on May the 5th at the O2 Arena, Bellew vs Haye, the rematch. And David Haye has been talking about Tony Bellew's performance in the first fight and ultimately pretty much saying that he doesn't have much power. But he gives him credit for other things as well. Now, ultimately in the first fight, for those who don't know, where have you been? But it was a fight that most people were predicting that David Haye would walk through Tony Bellew and stop him in the opening couple of rounds, being that David Haye has fast and got far more experience. And Tony Bellew has been a cruiserweight for quite some time, and prior to that a light heavyweight, and moving up to heavyweight to fight David Haye. Most people predict him to wipe him out. Tony Bellew broke his hand in the second round. Of course, we didn't know that until after the fight, of course, and David Haye was just swinging wildly. He wasn't doing what he normally does. A lot of it is because he just seemed bulky, more concerned about his physique, looking like a bodybuilder rather than a fighter. This time things are going to be different. I've already seen pictures of him. He's looking so much better than what he did in the first fight. The build-up was pretty good, but ultimately the fight, again, David Haye was just throwing wild shots. Even me, I could probably moved out of the way for a lot of those shots. And Tony Bellew would have found that easier, even with his broken hand in the second. But ultimately, the fight went to round 6, which again, most people predicted that it wouldn't. But David Haye tore his Achilles tendon in round number 6 and was fighting on one leg for 5 rounds. Again, people could say, well, why didn't Tony Bellew stop a one-legged man who had no power in his punches back and couldn't move? Why could he not stop David Haye? And it took him 5 rounds for Shane McGuigan, David Haye's trainer at the time, to throw the towel in. So I can certainly see why a lot of people say that, but ultimately, equally, David Haye should have stopped Tony Bellew before he even got to the 6th. And there was a lot of talk that David Haye was having some Achilles heel problems, and he had to go to Germany right before the fight as well. So David Haye denied it all, and ultimately his Achilles heel went in the fight, even though you could see him walking pretty sheepishly to the ring on the ring entrance. So ultimately there was some truth to it. Even now he still denies it, but how can you? Too much of a coincidence, right? But anyway, David Haye has said this about Tony Bellew: I took a lot of punches in that fight, and in lots of fights I've been legitimately knocked down, hurt. I know when a puncher can really do damage. At no stage in that fight, in the 11 rounds that we were there, did I feel that, oh, my legs are gone from punch power. I knew that before the fight. What I did underrate, though, was his stayability and his slipperiness. He was much better defensively than I thought going into the first fight. He was very cagey. He had a nice little shoulder roll. He was doing some clever things when I was coming at him and throwing all stupid punches. He did what any world-class boxer would do to negate my crude attacks. Credit to him, I underestimated his craftiness. He's been around in the game many years, like myself, so maybe it was a foolish move of me not expecting him to be able to do that. You live and learn, but now I know what he brings to the table, and I'm expecting him to be even better than he was last time, and I'm anticipating a very exciting fight from the first bell. That was David Haye's statement. Now, he's being kind of complimentary in some ways, but having digs in other ways. They generally don't like each other, and David Haye is doing all he can to not let Tony Bellew get under his skin, and I can kind of see why, because Tony Bellew, I don't know, when he talks, he's very condescending. He really is. And before the fight, he kept talking about how David Haye was a diva. You know, he'd turn up to the opening of an envelope if there was a camera there. Well, that kind of thing. And I totally agreed with it, because I've been saying this same thing ever since the Haymaker 2.0 was on his comeback from fighting Mark Demori, then Arnold Jujai. After he announced Arnold Jujai, that's when I really started to see what David Haye was about, which was conning the public to get money. He had a golden opportunity. He became mandatory. How he became mandatory for the WBO, I will never know after those 2 fights, but he did. And he ended up turning down a fight for the winner of Parker Andy Ruiz Jr. Ultimately turned out to be Joseph Parker, and went after Tony Bellew for money. And right then I knew the whole Haymaker 2.0 thing was complete crap. And Tony Bellew was right in a lot of things that he was saying. But of course, Tony Bellew was being, he was the antagonising one. And then when David Haye bit back, Tony Bellew was taking the moral high ground. I'm like, okay, you've been a bit two-faced there. But ultimately, Tony Bellew won the fight, and I wanted him to win the fight purely because I felt conned by David Haye for a while. But then after Tony Bellew turned into what he was accusing David Haye of, you know, every time you put a camera or a microphone in front of Tony Bellew, he would talk about how he beat the most feared man at heavyweight. You know, much like Wilder fans are doing with Luis Ortiz, calling him the boogeyman. And yet Luis Ortiz hasn't been a boogeyman for a couple of years. But this is what Tony Bellew was doing with David Haye. You know, I beat the boogeyman, the most skilled athlete at heavyweight, the one who hits the hardest at heavyweight. Now, that is debatable as to who hits harder, David Haye or Deontay Wilder. I'll probably edge it with Wilder, to be fair. But David Haye does have concussive one knockout punch, whereas Anthony Joshua, he is capable of it, but it does take him a couple of punches to put his opponent down and keep him down. But his Haymaker 2.0 has been nothing short of a con. And when the whole thing happened, I mean, don't get me wrong, I felt bad for David Haye in that fight. The way that, you know, he was hopping around on one leg for 5 rounds, and Tony Bellew didn't finish him off. And as I said, ultimately after the fight, he's talking about how, you know, he's beat the best heavyweight out there, and, you know, he's talking about fighting Deontay Wilder, he's talking about fighting Joseph Parker and this guy and that guy and Andre Ward. I'm like, mate, you turned out to be a diva yourself now. Everything that you accused David Haye of, you did. So this time, I'm quite happy for whoever wins, to be honest. I don't really care who wins. I'm just looking forward to a good fight. Is it pay-per-view? I'll probably say not. It's no longer boiling anymore, it's simmering. And I believe a lot of people are feeling that way. And ultimately, the first fight exceeded people's expectations. Very exciting. So people were excited to have the rematch. And it took a long, long time to get the rematch signed. And when it did, not long before the fight, David Haye pulled out, because he was running up and down a stairwell, which is what he does quite a lot of. He took a bit of a slip, went to grab hold of the banister to break his fall, and ended up pulling a tendon in his bicep. Freak accidents and all that. But ultimately, since then, people have been like, right, I'm not bothered about this fight anymore, and which is probably why there's still some tickets left. But ultimately, it's still a very good fight, and I anticipate things to heat up a little bit closer to the time. Of course, Matchroom are going to be focusing on the Amir Khan and Le Greco fight coming up in Liverpool first, and then a couple of weeks after that will be the Haye Bellew undercard. Sorry, the Bellew Haye card, not undercard, of course not. Although the undercard looking pretty good actually. So yeah, definitely looking forward to it. And Tony Bellew did do better than what most people thought that he did, but a lot of that could have been down to the fact that David Haye fought like a damn amateur in that fight, just swinging bombs, wasn't boxing. He looked heavy, looked sluggish, looked awful, but now he's looking so much better, as in physically. How will he fight? Ultimately, we don't know, but I am predicting a knockout win for David Haye in this one, which could, who knows, end up setting up a trilogy fight, which is what David Haye originally said that he wanted. So now, as far as the punching power goes from Tony Bellew, yeah, how can you not knock out a guy on one leg in 5 rounds? How can you not do that? And I am a fan of both fighters. Of course, they're British. I all support my own. But how could you not stop a guy on one leg? Much like Errol Spence, how could you not stop Kell Brook in 5 rounds with one eye? It's amazing to me how Tony Bellew couldn't do it. So David Haye, fit and healthy, really, what chance do you give Tony Bellew? Unless David Haye is shot now. If he goes in there and loses to Tony Bellew again, seriously, man, close the curtains, kiss him goodnight. That should be it. I never ever want to see David Haye back in the ring again. So yeah, I can probably agree, just from the outsider's point of view, looking in, that Tony Bellew had very little to no power in that fight. He was a bit more elusive, as in he could see David Haye's shots coming. But to be honest, I think most people would have, and that's the truth of it, because like I said, his shots were wild, and you could see them coming a mile off. And I'm pretty sure that I could have moved out of the way for a lot of those punches. But ultimately, Tony Bellew was the one in the ring. Tony Bellew was the one who had to move. Tony Bellew, not the most exciting fighter in the world, but he does bring some some decent moments in fights, that is for sure. And he is an overachiever, and I think he will be the first person to admit that as well. But anyway, we'll have to wait and see, and hopefully both these guys, or whoever wins this fight, be humble in your victory. Don't want to hear no more about how Tony Bellew beat the baddest man and the most dangerous man in heavyweight, or David Haye saying how he avenged his defeat, and Tony Bellew was a world-class athlete when he's been saying that he isn't for a long time. You know, in other words, don't go changing your tune. Be humble with it. Move on. So anyway, May the 5th, O2 Arena. Still some tickets left. Very surprising, right? But of course, a lot of people are still kind of thinking maybe this fight isn't going to happen, something will happen and this fight will not go ahead. But ultimately we have to wait and see. So drop your thoughts below, click that thumbs up, subscribe. Catch you next video.